Okay, thank you very much. Thank you all very much for coming this evening to the second in our series of innovation and engagement public lectures. We're delighted to welcome Professor Duncan Green, who's an honorary professor here in the School of Planning and Geography at Cardiff University. I'm not going to run through Duncan's CV because I can't possibly do justice to it in a couple of minutes. Suffice it to say that for many years he's worked as a professional journalist. He's worked in Latin America. He's worked for many NGOs, including CAVOD, and more recently, currently I should say, Oxfam. Duncan's most recent book is here, called From Poverty to Power. He also runs one of the liveliest and most engaging blogs that I know on development, and I urge you at least to look at it. Duncan is also selling books, and afterwards he tells me he'll even be signing them as well.
Anything.
What more could we ask for? So on that note, over to you, Duncan.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. It's great to be here. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks to the school and the university. So a few years ago, so 2008, we published this book. It was a kind of an attempt by a large international NGO, Oxfam, to pull together its thinking and say, this is kind of how we see development. And the logic was that we just felt that the economists were having it all their own way. All the big books on development were being written by economists like Bill Easterly and Jeff Sachs, and they're quite often wrong, or partly wrong. And we just thought we'd put something, a different narrative out there. Now, NGOs love having meetings and being consulted. So by the time this thing was finished, we reckon about 500 people had been involved in it. The book was 500 pages long, so each person got a page. And it was kind of a big exercise. But what was interesting was that we didn't know what the answer was before we started, this is quite unusual for NGOs. Normally you decide what your policy is and then you work back to the evidence, right? This time we did it the other way around, and what emerged from this big discussion about how Oxfam has seen development in its 70 years in all the countries we worked, is that you need these two basic elements. You need, if you care about development as purely an economic affair, the rising income that enables you to feed your families, then you need effective states. You need South Korea, Botswana, Taiwan. Country after country that has taken off in the last 70 years has done so through having states that guarantee infrastructure, educate, and make sure their people are healthy, have an industrial policy, a plan for upgrading the economy, a bunch of stuff. And that's for a sort of narrow view of development. But if you take the Amartya Sen view of development, the development is about the freedoms to be and to do. It's about people acquiring agency and control over their own lives. Then the book argued you need this other part of the equation, active citizens. And that's something which Oxfam is very engaged with in many countries. I've just come back from Tanzania looking at some of our work there in terms of promoting this agency of poor people in order to change their lives. And the interesting bit, and I'll stop the first edition here, is what happens between those two groups. Are active citizens and effective states like this? Are they like this? Or somewhere in between? And what's the role for aid and outsiders, like Oxfam usually is, in terms of making sure it's a productive relationship and not a destructive relationship. So that's a kind of the very broad brush summary. And then last year it was decided, because books have about a 5-year shelf life and then they wither and die unless you update them. So we decided to update it, which was great and traumatic, because if you're an author and you write a book, you obviously never read it again until you have to update it. And then you go back and reread it and you think, oh my God, I said that. And the book came out in 2008, which was a busy year in terms of a global financial crash and things like that. So I sort of scoured through looking for, I found one line which said, storm clouds gathering over the world economy. And thought, oh, I predicted everything, that's fine, it's great. So once you get over the trauma, it was actually really fascinating to just compare a 2008 narrative on development with a 2012-13 one. So what I wanted to do was just summarize some of the interesting things that seem to have bubbled up. There's this constant churn of ideas and fashions and fuzzwords and buzzwords and all sorts of kind of terms in development. And some of them have clearly shifted in the last 5 years, and that's what I wanted to talk about. So I'll talk briefly about 4 big shocks, 4 big things that have changed the way we think about development, and then I'll talk about actually the way the thinking's changed. So the first one, which I alluded to, was the global financial crisis. Yeah? None of us predicted it, actually. Nobody in Oxfam really understood it. It's not something that NGOs do much work on. And it's not something people expect us to do much work on. So we've been forced to go back to school a bit on this, try and understand what banking regulation's about, try and understand a bit about the importance of the financial system for development. And we had massively underestimated the importance of the fact, for example, that the flow of capital across borders every day is 100 times greater than the flow of goods and services, the flow of the real economy. So if that massive financial system has a little shiver, then it really shakes up the real economy. So we kind of ignored and not thought enough about some of the issues around this. One of the interesting things that has emerged since the financial crisis is a much greater interest in banking regulation, fine, but also in taxation. People have started to think much more about financial systems, international taxation, the focus on the Robin Hood tax, the financial transactions tax, which has actually been approved by 11 countries in Europe. These kind of sort of financial stuff, which we thought was too boring to talk about before 2008, now suddenly become major campaign issues. A bit like the debt crisis did 15 years ago or so. So it's been a big shift, I think, in terms of our understanding of the role of finance. But if you went to poor countries in 2008, 2009, and asked people about the crisis, they wouldn't have thought you were talking about the banking crisis. They would have thought you were talking about food. Because something very odd happened in 2008, which was after 30 years of food prices globally falling steadily in real terms, and hunger falling with it, in 2008, the food system went into some kind of extraordinary spasm, and prices went right up, and then since then have been going up and down like yo-yos. So there's some huge thing going on with the food system, big arguments about why it is, about why the food price system has gone so crazy. This was a piece of research from Zambia where the researcher ignored our instructions completely. There's a good lesson here. She was supposed to be doing focus groups and stuff, and she just got a camera out and asked a group of women to put together what they could have bought a year before, and then with the same money, what they could buy this year. Been much the most used and most useful thing of that research. Lesson for all researchers: ignore your instructions, and then if you succeed, you'll be remembered, and if you fail, you'll be sacked. But in this case, she succeeded, and that's been we're trying to do more of this kind of photo comparison rather than always use text to understand what's going on with the food crisis. The impact of that was to make us think about food and hunger. I mean, you kind of wonder why we weren't thinking that much about it before, but I think globally and in the aid business, farming and agriculture had been rather neglected. The amount of aid, the proportion of aid going into farming and food production had been falling for decades. People thought it was kind of an old problem and it was kind of getting solved. That's definitely shifted since 2008. Much more thinking about small farmers, about how you get small farmers into markets, because that's where most of the poor people are. And thinking about food as a system and what we can do to reduce that incredible price volatility that we've been seeing in the last few years. Whoop, other way. Third shock was actually a positive shock, at least initially. So again, completely unpredicted. Just before the Arab Spring in 2011, Danny Roderick, who is a hero among economists, really good Harvard, well, he was Harvard, he's moved on, was writing pieces about the Muslim tigers, pointing out that 5 of the top 10 performing countries on health and education in the world were majority Muslim countries, most of them in North Africa. And then, bang, there was this enormous chaotic uprising, political instability, and it's still playing out in Egypt, Libya, Syria. So this one hasn't finished yet. This made us think about several things which we hadn't really thought enough about before. The role of women in majority Muslim countries. We'd kind of We'd been doing a little bit of work on women's rights in Muslim contexts. We've been doing a lot more since then. It made us think about the unpredictability of political change, and I'll come back to that. I think it's a really profound challenge to the kind of planning mentality in the aid business, this question of unpredictability. And it made us think, it absolutely stood up the argument that active citizenship was a major driver of change in developing countries. You know, this was an extraordinary uprising. Then the fourth shock is a sort of slow motion train crash. When I went back and read the red version of the book, it was quite surprising to read this future tense applied to climate change. If we don't get carbon emissions down, this is what's predicted. This is, you know, these are the dangers, these are the risks. Oxfam is now spending an increasing amount of its money on climate change that's happening already, with the difference that it's not so much global warming as chaos. So I was in Zambia in March, and we were getting contacted by farmers' organizations saying, we're getting frosts. We've never had frosts before. Can you get us some help? Can you find people to come in and help us deal with this kind of new threat we're facing to our production? You're getting rains coming when the dry season should be. You're getting the winds changing direction. You're getting drought hitting when the rains should be. And this has a very traumatic effect on producers, and many of whom use traditional rules of thumb for when to do stuff on the farm. So if you've always planted because you know the rains are coming, and suddenly you can't predict the rains, it's pretty difficult for farmers. So we're doing work trying to get people in, trying to bring in useful forms of weather forecasting, for example, and make them accessible to, say, illiterate farmers. These kind of sort of trying to find ways to help people adapt to this increasing climate chaos. It doesn't look like it's going to get better this century. It's probably going to get worse. So that adaptation to climate change has become increasingly important, as well as trying to get emissions down in the rich countries and increasingly the middle-income countries. So those four shocks have come to dominate our thinking, I think. Finance, Arab Spring, food, and climate are right sort of uppermost now in a way that they weren't 5 years ago. Decided to have a little sleep. There we go. So how's that affected our thinking? I want to point out, sort of talk about four different areas. I want to talk about the way we're changing how we understand poverty itself. I want to talk about inequality. A little bit about complexity, complex systems. I'll explain all these. And then a final bit, which is more the work I'm doing at the moment, which is on trying to get better at understanding power and how change happens, social, economic, political change. Hold on, how do I get back from this? Help, techie person. Hold on a sec. There we go. Use the keyboard is the answer. Okay. So the first is, what do we mean by poverty? Up until about 10 years ago, there was a fairly clear agreement that poverty was about income. Lots of arguments about how you measure the income, whether it's $1 or now $1.25 a day, $2.50 a day, national poverty lines versus global poverty lines, but there was a focus on income. Over the last 5 years, there's been a really good shift away from just thinking about income, and I think prompted by actually talking to poor people. One of the questions I like to ask in Oxfam, just to make people uncomfortable, is to ask people, when was the last time you actually talked to a poor person who wasn't in some sort of serving capacity? And I see senior managers' faces go, ooh, don't want to think about that. When you talk to poor people and ask them about their lives, you get a completely different picture of poverty from the $1.25 picture. No one has ever said to me, my problem is I've got $1.24 a day, and if I had $1.26, my life would be so different. That's not how it works. The best study, I think, of that real poverty was actually by the World Bank in the late 90s. It goes back a bit, where they talked to 60,000 poor people in 50 countries with a really good, sort of rigorous methodology to get under the skin of this and try and get into the minds and hearts of poor people and produce this thing called Voices of the Poor, which is a great series of studies. And what emerged from that is that poverty is a sense of being. It's a sense of identity. It's about vulnerability, anxiety, shame, worry about what if. What if someone gets injured and I had to pay massive hospital fees? What if the breadwinner loses their job, has an accident, whatever? What if my daughter gets married and we have to pay a shed load of cash for the wedding and take out loans to cover it? You know, there's all of these shocks, sort of little family idiosyncratic shocks, and people without the means to cope with them is a much better picture of what poverty is than a mere average income picture. The other aspect of poverty which people have become more aware of is that, okay, right now there are roughly 1.4 billion people in the world, 1 in 5, living under $1.25 a day, okay? Which is a pretty shocking number. Of those 1.4 billion, 1 billion during the course of the year will go in and out. They churn in and out of poverty depending on the time of year, depending on whether they've had a good harvest, whether they're in the hunger season before the harvest, all sorts of reasons why people go in and out of poverty. 400 million are the chronic poor, permanently poor. And the crucial point from the point of view of policy is that they're different people from the 1 billion. The chronic poor are a kind of constellation of disenfranchised groups, the elderly, the people living in very remote places, the disabled, indigenous minorities, or a mixture of all of the above. And the way you help those people is not the same as the way you help the 1 billion who are churning in and out. The 1 billion churning in and out are much more likely to benefit from growth, job creation, all those things. Growth and job creation is not going to help a disabled, elderly, indigenous woman living 2 days from the nearest road, right? So you need different approaches, much more focus on government, on social policy, basically, to deal with these kind of things. So, yeah, I might just start using these. Yes, in fact, I'll definitely start using these. So, implications for the aid and development world. Change what you measure. Whenever you're discussing an issue, there's inevitably a massive argument on what do you measure. Because until you measure it, for a large part of people working in the aid business, it's not real. So what you measure and how you measure it's always really critical. So can we measure well-being? Yeah? Some really interesting experiments going on at government level in particular, not so much in the aid world, about trying to measure people's well-being rather than GDP per capita. You know, and a lot of governments making real progress on that. Tackling hardcore the chronic stuff, but also what the food price crisis in particular has shown us is that we're missing a huge piece of the equation when we try and understand the implications of these shocks on poverty, which is the care economy. So you have this kind of reservoir of essentially women and grandmothers, older women, doing childcare, sort of reproductive work, house, running the home, and they are constantly acting as a kind of sponge to be the cushion for new shocks. So, food price crisis hits, families got to get more money, more women go out to work, dump the kids on the grandmother suddenly has to look after more kids. No public policy aimed at helping them in most countries. So unless you start thinking about the care economy as well, you don't get to the right policies to help people through these ups and downs. One of the things about volatility, about stuff going up and down, is that it makes you think much more about smoothing mechanisms. It makes you think, how do you reduce volatility? And how do you enable people to cope with the ups and downs? We have a natural disaster every year in Britain. It's called winter, right? If we didn't have nice walls and houses and heating, there would be people dying by the thousand out there, because of the snow and the cold. We've got the resilience, we've got the sort of the ability to cope with that. And people are now much more thinking in terms of how do you equip or help communities build their resilience to these shocks. Resilience is just the latest of what I call fuzzwords. Okay? Fuzzwords are like buzzwords, but more fuzzy. And they're great. Fuzzwords are actually not silly. They're really useful because when you have a fuzzword like resilience, everybody starts discussing something which is they all roughly agree what it is, and everything's fine until someone tries to define it, and then you have a terrible argument. But while you're doing that, you have a really good conversation, and you start thinking about new stuff. So resilience, I think, is quite a useful fuzzword, and it's become very, very critical in a lot of our discussions about how do you help people cope with this new age of volatility and shocks. That one. Good. Okay. Second topic. Inequality. What would we do without Brazil? Eh? Brazil has photogenic forms of inequality in the world. Fantastic place for plundering by NGOs and others. This is in Sao Paulo, where they kindly built a tennis court right next to a favela. Thanks, guys. But interestingly, Brazil is actually a huge success story on reducing inequality at the moment. So we might have to start using photos from different places. There's a guy called Branko Milanovic at the World Bank who is amazing. He's almost stopped using English as a language, or any language. He now tweets graphs, right? And if you are interested in graphs and inequality, follow Branko Milanovic. This is one of his. He worked out where had the money gone, right? The actual dollars of growth in the world economy from 1988 to 2008, just before the financial crisis, versus the centile of the global distribution. So the really rich guys, the top 1% here, the very poor, the bottom 1% down there, and everywhere in between. And the picture has a couple of characteristics. One is the top 2%, have had over half of the extra dollars have gone to the top 2% in the world. Many of them in the north, but actually increasing number. Africa has something like 50 billionaires now. Increasing number elsewhere as well. But then there's an interesting little dip here, which is basically us. So this is Europe and North America, normal people, rather than sort of, Abramovich or people, where real incomes have been totally static since 1988. A blip, which is the rising economies, Chinese, Indian middle classes, those sort of people, and then down again. The point here is that there has been a massive increase in inequality at the top, and that's one of the sort of drivers of the Occupy movement, but also it's really pushed inequality up the agenda. So the IMF is publishing papers saying inequality is so extreme that it's economically dysfunctional. 10 years ago, inequality was a good stimulus to entrepreneurialism. It's changed because it's got so much worse, I think, partly. And it's very varied between countries. These are the G20 countries, the new kind of steering committee. To the left is inequality getting worse. To the right is inequality getting better. And the interesting thing here is that 3 of the 4 major economies where inequality is falling, i.e. it's getting better, from my point of view anyway, are Latin American. Now, Latin America has always been a byword for inequality, and it's still very high, but it's coming down across Latin America. Brazil in particular is going through a transition which can only really be compared to the New Deal in the US in the 1930s. They've abolished hunger. They've abolished poverty. They're on the verge of abolishing hunger. They've had extraordinary social progress in the last 15, 20 years under different governments as well. But Argentina and Mexico are also bringing inequality down. So I think there's lots to be looked at in terms of why some countries are doing better than others. It's not just about social policy, but it is partly. And there's a kind of interesting learning experience between the G20 countries there. So, implications. The metrics again, which is, we've traditionally not thought much about how you measure inequality. There's been this mystical thing called the Gini index, which measures how far you depart from absolutely equal distribution of income. But actually it's a pretty rubbish measure of the kind of inequality I'm talking about. So a very good economist from Cambridge called Gabriel Palma, a Chilean, actually did some fascinating work on looking on getting under the skin of inequality in different countries. And some of his followers have developed a Palma index. He's very happy about this. Have developed a Palma index which says, let's compare how much the top 10% of the population get with the bottom 40%. And you get a lot more information about inequality and a lot more variation between countries than if you just take the Gini index. That's a bit techie. Promise, I won't. That's the techie high point of this talk. Okay, it comes down from now on. Except for the next bullet, which is, I was saying poverty, people are looking at the different dimensions of poverty, vulnerability, anxiety, these kind of questions. That hasn't really happened yet on inequality. Inequality discussions are still largely about income or assets. I haven't seen anything on inequality of shame or inequality of fear. I think that's probably going to come though. One of the issues about inequality is it's made us think much more about the other side of the ledger. We've always talked about how to spend it. NGOs are great at suggesting new ways to spend money. But if you care about inequality, you actually worry a lot about how the money is raised in the form of taxation or revenue, because you can raise money in a way that is very equalizing, as happens in most European countries, or you can raise money in a way that's actually very disequalizing, as happens in some other countries. So we're doing much more work now on taxation and how you raise domestic resources for governments. Aid is becoming less and less significant. 50 out of 55 African countries are now either drilling for oil and gas or actively exploring and expecting to find oil and gas. Once you find oil and gas, you really don't need aid nearly as much. The money comes out of the ground. What you do with that money is absolutely critical to whether it's a curse or a blessing when that stuff comes on stream. So these are the kind of things we're doing much more work on. Inequality is also really tricky for outsiders to work on. Inequality is about relationships. I can be a poor person. I can't be an unequal person. I can only be unequal compared to other people. So as soon as you start talking about inequality, you start talking about relationships, you start talking about power imbalances, and you start talking about redistribution. All of these are highly political, highly charged issues. And I think there's a real question for NGOs like Oxfam, but even more for somebody like DFID, to what extent can they actually start working on inequality and redistribution in other countries before they're accused of meddling with internal affairs. So I think it's a very sensitive issue if you're going to take this stuff seriously. And we're doing on time. Okay, good. Complexity. Do people know this one? This is a US military PowerPoint. Soldiers do it to each other as well. This is from Afghanistan, and it shows all the different sort of stakeholders. It's a stakeholder map in Afghanistan and a rough idea of the relationships between them. When I saw this, first of all, everybody laughed at it when it came out. Right? The guy who drew it up was sacked by General Petraeus, and everybody said, clearly they don't understand Afghanistan. If you actually look at it, it's pretty clear that at least the person who drew the map up has a pretty good grasp of Afghanistan, actually. I wish our teams could do anything like as good a mapping in most of the countries where we work. And the point about this is everything is connected to everything else. There are huge numbers of feedback loops. And if you poke this system with $100 million of aid, 10,000 Marines, that kind of thing, there are so many ways that the ripples will go through that system, it is absolutely impossible to predict what will happen. When you poke a complex system, you cannot predict the outcome. It's not that you're not clever enough. There is no computer that will tell you. There is nothing. With that many feedback loops, it's not soluble as a problem. Now, the point about this is most of the political, economic, social systems we work in look like this, right? But the kind of imaginary world of the aid business is completely different from this. We have these different kind of models of change. Let me explain. There's baking a cake, all right? To bake a cake, you need a recipe. You need the ingredients, you need an oven, and you need some skill, right? But even if you don't have the skill, if you follow the recipe and do the ingredients, shove it in the oven, you'll get something out at the end which looks like a cake, maybe not like that, but it will be edible, roughly. That is the model for most aid projects and programs. You follow a recipe, you do the same thing wherever you are, it's just a cake, and you have quite a linear way of analyzing, I'm going to do this, I expect to achieve this, I'll measure it, and whatever I measure will be attributable to what I did. Logical framework, impact chains, logic models, there's all sorts of jargon that goes with it. But the basic idea is, if I do something, I will achieve something, and I will know that I've achieved it. All right? Landing someone on the moon is different from baking a cake, clearly. Much more complicated. But the point is, this is a simple system. This is a complicated system. A complicated system is if you're smart enough and have enough rocket scientists in the room, you can actually land someone on the moon with a fair degree of certainty that you can achieve it. That's like a very large aid infrastructure project, one of these kind of things. If you start, when you have a baby, if you decide that the way you're going to raise this baby is to have a really impressive logical framework, which is going to set out your activities and inputs as a parent over the next 20 years and the intended outcomes in terms of the child that comes out at the end, the child will be a psycho, right? What you actually do if you're raising a child, well, everybody does it differently, important point. There's no right and wrong, second important point, but you basically make it up as you go along. You respond to stimulus, you learn from them, they learn from you, events are unpredictable, you ride the wave, you try and get some sleep, you just manage, right? Now, much more aid is like that, but our imaginary world is like this. So what actually happens is, you live like this, you cope, you improvise, and then when you come to write up your report at the end, you pretend you were baking a cake and you work backwards. And you show that you followed all the guidelines and all the best practices, and you did this great monitoring and evaluation, and thank you very much, and can I have some more money, please? Right? Now that's kind of a total waste of time, right? I mean, why do we tell ourselves lies like this? But also it means we don't actually learn, we don't get better at this kind of stuff. We are constantly have this imaginary world, and people who are on the ground have to kind of ride these two horses at the same time, and it's very uncomfortable, as anyone who's tried to ride two horses at the same time will tell you. We need to get much better at understanding complexity and actually admit that that's what life is like. So I sort of try and boil this down. How do we plan when we don't know what's going to happen, right? There's a group of people in the aid business who do this all the time. They're the humanitarian people, the emergencies people. They don't know where the earthquake's going to be, but they can plan. They're going to have stuff here and stuff there and stuff there. They know roughly what spread of skills they need, and then when something happens, they will jump. The rest of the development business feel very uncomfortable with that. They don't like the interruption to the plan. They like to spend an awfully long time drawing up the perfect plan and then just grind through it, whatever happens in the world outside. So we need to get better at all of us thinking about how do you plan when you don't know what's going to happen. For the campaigners, I don't know if there are campaigners here, but when I got to Oxfam, I was taken to one side and said there's a very simple rule to campaigning. All right? For a good campaign, you need a problem, a solution, and a villain. Right? Hero's optional, but you really need a problem, a solution, and a villain. And if you've got that, you get a great campaign. And actually, if you look at the campaigns which go big and have impact, it's quite a good guideline. Trouble is, in a situation like that Afghanistan, you don't have a solution. So normally we would lie and pretend we have a solution, but actually there are other ways to do this rather than tell fibs, which tends to weaken your position over time. So I think we need to think about campaigning in a different way. And then the third point is, if you don't know what's going to happen and you're riding the wave, you need to notice what's going on with the wave. Right? You need fast feedback and an ability to respond to it. For the first we knew in Oxfam House, the mothership in Oxford, of the global price spike was when journalists phoned us up and asked us for a comment. Right? We have people all over the world on the ground who I'm sure were completely aware that something weird was going on with food prices. They just didn't think it was their business to tell us. Right? That is clearly a problem in terms of the feedback loops. So we have to really get the feedback in place so that we can attempt to ride with complex systems rather than have this crazy planning obsession. Last bit. Good. So this is kind of coming out of the book and into the next book, if Oxfam ever let me write another book, which is, let's start with power. Okay, there's power in this room. Okay, I can't see it. I'm like an aid worker coming in to a country, and you don't know who's powerful, who's not. In this room, there are people who are senior, there are people who are junior, there are people who want things from other people, there are people who really annoy each other, there's people who are probably in relationships or ex-relationships, all sorts of stuff I can't see. So, and that's a kind of decent analogy for what happens when you're going into a community, into a country. There's power in the room, but you can't see it. So the first job, I think, is how do you make that power visible? Once you try and make the power visible and try and understand the different kinds of power that connect people and the way it's distributed, who's not got power, who's got too much power, then you can start thinking about how change might happen in that system. So there's a whole area of power analysis which we're trying to, and there's lots of different frameworks and tools to do this, but it's to base, the essence is making power visible. And then once you've got that, then you can start talking about what's your theory of change? How do you think change actually happens? Yeah, there's people in the aid business who think change only happens through unleashing market forces, right? I had a boss at Difford who got into trouble by writing to his bosses and saying, when you unleash the market forces, could you let me know, because I want to come and watch, right? And he got slapped down seriously for doing that. There are other people who think it's got to be protest, right? There are other people who think it's got to be women's empowerment. And they're all right, but at the moment, they're all not acknowledging their assumptions and they're not talking about it. So there's an important part there about making assumptions visible. Good theories of change help you actually look beyond the usual suspects, you know. If you're thinking about how do poor people form their view of the world, how do they decide whether to be passive or active, how do they decide whether to accept the status quo or challenge it, there is one institution which is absolutely crucial in almost all countries, and that is faith institutions, right? And yet aid is a phenomenally secular business. I used to work for CAFOD, the Catholic aid agency, and even CAFOD was secular. You know, I mean, like, it was there was a kind of group of people who would come in on a Thursday, and it was like they were going into an opium den or something. They would go in and have a little mass in a little side room, but it was always shameful. So actually thinking about the role of faith in the lives of poor people would transform the way we work. We really struggle with that one. The other good thing about theories of change is it actually gives you something to test. It gives you hypotheses. It gives you things to work out whether we actually know what's going on, try a few things, then change them. Okay, some examples of how to do this kind of stuff. Fast feedback I've talked about. How do you work in a situation like Afghanistan, like that model I showed you? Well, one is maybe you should just concentrate on the enabling environment. You know, people's access to finance, people's access to information, people's access to new ideas might be more effective than having a particular plan to take everything down to the grassroots and complete that, you know, one task, find some little bit of linearity in this great mess of complexity. Try lots of different things and expect some of them to fail. So I've just been visiting a program of ours in Tanzania where we say we've got a venture capitalist model of development. Difford loved it. When we called it that, they gave us some more money, because it's terribly private sector and macho and great. But actually what you're saying is we're expecting loads of things to fail, because that's what venture capitalists do, right? But if we said we have a 90% failure rate, we probably wouldn't have got more money from Difford, but that's the same thing. A venture capitalist invests in 10 things, expects lots of them to fail. The difference is venture capitalists notice when they fail and stop funding them and put the money in other things. That's a very good model in a complex system when you don't know what's going to work. And we've been trying that in a very interesting way in Tanzania. Getting people in a room. In Tajikistan, our water program was a disaster, and so we got some money from the Swiss to just get everybody working on water into the room. 17 government ministries who weren't talking to each other, all the big aid agencies, donors, civil society organizations, private sector. All we do is get them in the room, keep them happy. There's a kind of charismatic, jokey water engineer who sort of keeps everybody happy, and see what comes out of it. They meet every 2 months, and they've produced new laws, they've produced new processes, and they've produced new investment. We couldn't have predicted any of that. We couldn't have written a funding application saying we will achieve X. We had no idea what was going to come out of that. So again, that's a model for a complex system. Focus on problems. There's really interesting work by Matt Andrews at Harvard saying the key for outsiders is to help people recognize and understand problems and then stand back. Yeah? You say there is a huge problem with women dying in childbirth here. We don't know what the answer is, but it's a really big problem. You help people research it, you help people publicize it, you get everybody working on things linked to maternal mortality in a room, and then you say, right, see what you can come up with. Yeah, very good sort of way of dealing with this rather than pretending that we have the answers all the time. And the final one is rules of thumb. Right? When the Marines go into combat in Afghanistan, the US Marines, they do not have the equivalent of the Oxfam program manual, with a page on everything that could ever possibly happen. They say, take the high ground, stay in communication, keep moving, and improvise, right? Which is what most aid workers actually do. They only read that when they have to write up their report at the end. So getting better rules of thumb for how we work is probably a much more sensible idea than thinking you can plan everything. Final thing, there is an enormous clash brewing in development between two big tribes, okay? There's the tribe I've just talked about, the complexity tribe, the people who understand that life is about systems, about unpredictability, about riding the wave, about feedback loops. And then there are the results people. The results and value for money people are saying, we can only get support for aid if you show us that it's having an impact. To show us it's having an impact, you have to measure results and show that that's down to what you did, okay? And these are quite incompatible at the moment, these two groups of people. The measurement people are going to win because they have the money. So the complexity people have got to learn how to measure what matters rather than a load of irrelevant stuff. And they're doing very badly at it at the moment. So I think there is going to be an important struggle for the soul of the sort of aid and development business over the next few years. Final thing, there is a book. It is on sale at an enormous discount. But there's also a blog, as Kevin mentioned, which is free, and you can argue, and it gets more readers than the book, and it's all very depressing, but it's kind of fun to write. So do come and join in on that one. Thank you very much.